welcome everyone to our event. A quick word before we start about IDEA. We are National Network for Development Education and Global Citizenship Education. We represent between 100 and 120 members all across the island of Ireland, and we have some members as well in Northern Ireland. We represent members doing development education in the formal, informal and non-formal settings. And if you want to find out more about our work and our members, you can find more information on our website. I'm really excited to hand the floor over to our brilliant moderator, Valery Molay, who's a climate justice policy expert, activist, and is currently program manager at Women Engage for a Common Future. I'll let Valery tell more about her role, and I hope you all enjoy this event and this very important conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me here as your moderator. My role, how I see my role today, is just to allow the space for us to hear, listen to new information, old information, reminders, things that will bring us back again to the questions about climate justice and what is fueling it and how can we respond to it? How can we even talk about it in different spaces? How do we find solution together? And so through our speakers, but also through the conversation that we will have at the end. So like Alia said, I work within the frame of climate justice, which really, for me, the way I sort of summarize it, it's a framework that acknowledges the systemic inequality and how it interplays with climate change. So what I mean by systemic inequality, such as like racism, gender disparity, disability, colonialism, how does that shapes the vulnerability and the access that people have both to the resources, but also the solution to climate change. So it's really about challenging power structure and trying to advocate for solution from the intersectional perspective. I'm sure we will hear a lot more about this from our esteemed panelists today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Vanessa Conroy, who is a project officer of the Feminist Community for Climate Justice, a joint project between the National Women Council of Ireland, Community Work Ireland, which aims to put a gender and feminist and community work lens through the climate justice. Vanessa, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. So as Valery said, I work for a project called Feminist Communities for Climate Justice. It's a joint project between the National Women's Council of Ireland and Community Work Ireland. And we aim, as Valery said, to put like a feminist and intersectional lens on climate impact here in Ireland. But our work does obviously take in the global to local lens. And I'm hoping to kind of highlight intersectional feminist climate justice today. So I will kick off. So I'm sure lots of people and our speakers probably have definitions of climate justice or what they consider climate justice to be. I'm going to just use the definition that we have on our own project, just for kind of the sake of keeping consistency throughout the presentation. And for us, climate justice recognizes that the impacts of climate change and climate breakdown will not be felt evenly, and that those in society who are already disadvantaged or socially excluded will face more negative impacts. And achieving climate justice means that we can't kind of see climate and social justice as two siloed pieces of work to be done. We need to tackle these issues at the same time. We need to recognize and reduce inequalities in our society, as well as reducing greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. Importantly, we should do this to create a greener world that is also fairer and more equal. And ultimately, that doesn't mean we can just slap low carbon label on everything and continue business as usual. It means creating systemic change rather than, again, greening the business as usual model, which is why we often hear at climate protests, system change, not climate change. Otherwise, then we create a society which is we're net zero, we reduced our emissions, but we still have social injustice, and we should aspire to far better than that. We like to say that climate change is a threat multiplier or an exacerbator of existing social inequalities, meaning it escalates social, political, and economic tensions, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected settings, but it can also bring on those types of kind of feelings to settings. In our own feminist climate justice report, which we published last April as one of the outputs of our project, we named 5 dimensions of climate injustice, really. And what we say is that marginalised and socially excluded groups in the face of climate change have contributed the least greenhouse gases causing climate change, are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, tend to be burdened by climate policy to tackle climate change. They're also least likely to see the benefits of those climate policies, particularly if they're things like tax breaks or discounts for early adoption, because that often means it comes with a certain level of disposable income to be an early adopter of things like retrofitting or electric vehicles. And most importantly, they also do not have their voices heard in decision-making spaces and are also less likely to be in those spaces. So we have strategies and policies and so on designed without their input and without their experiences at the heart of them. For us, we use a feminist climate justice approach and a community development approach, which I'll elaborate on a little later. But for us, feminist climate justice is about paying attention to the gendered and intersectional characteristics of all dimensions of climate justice. So those 5 dimensions that I just went over, thinking about the gendered implications of those and the intersectional implications of those. And throughout the presentation, I think there's only 2 or 3 in this one, but you'll see these little pink bubbles. And these are actually responses from community outreach that we did in the first year of the project when we asked people about what would climate justice mean for you and your life. And this particular one says, leaving no one behind and reaching the furthest behind first, listening, responding to communities who will have to adapt. Really in our work, what we like to do is tie climate change to the very immediate needs and immediate areas in the lives of communities. So we talk about things like housing, access to public transport, access to good quality, healthy food, and so on. And so housing is such a topical issue, particularly in Ireland right now, that's the one that we use to kind of really connect climate justice to people's everyday lives. And in our own work as well, we always use an intersectional approach in our own work, and we also advocate for it to be used at all levels of climate decision making. And we need to consider how multiple disadvantages can interact and create unique challenges and impacts in the face of the climate crisis. And these are just a few examples of communities who might be already marginalized or who might be particularly disadvantaged or impacted by not only climate change, but also policy that doesn't pay adequate attention to existing social inequality in our society. And as well as just considering these groups on their own, obviously a big piece of intersectionality is the fact that we inhabit lots of different identities at once. So here's just one example that's quite typical of Ireland anyway, like an older woman, like she might be disabled, living in a rural area, and she's far more likely to suffer from some kind of socioeconomic disadvantage. And so considering how we go from considering just these little siloed communities to considering that many of us will inhabit multiple identities and therefore in our current system, multiple forms of disadvantage at the same time. So on the global scale, when we're talking about kind of contributors to current climate change, we know that richer countries in the global north have contributed the bulk of greenhouse gases causing global climate change, and that countries in the global south are seeing the worst impacts of the climate crisis, but have contributed very little in comparison to the emissions that are causing climate change. And inequality in resources and money to adapt and defend against climate change impacts are caused due to historical and ongoing global power imbalances between the global north and south, and particularly the legacy of colonialism and what we call neo-colonialism, which is really the impacts of colonization still being felt to this day by many countries. And it's easy enough to kind of spell this out in words, but there's this website I really love called carbonmap.org, which is an interactive map of the world. And if you take a look at it and ask it, well, who are the current highest emitters in the world? And you can kind of see, you've got America and Europe, and you've got China quite big here as well. But I think a big piece that many people don't maybe not realize about climate change is that the emissions that are causing the climate change we're experiencing right now are historical emissions. So these are emissions from back in like the 1800s, around the times of like the Industrial Revolution, when we are really starting to pump coal and emissions into our atmosphere. So if you ask carbonmap.org, well, who are the historical emitters? Who are the ones most responsible for the emissions that are in the atmosphere right now? It suddenly looks very different in that America and Europe become huge, and you see countries like China start to shrink down a little here, and always noting that the likes of South America and Africa are quite small in comparison. And then finally, if you ask carbonmap.org, where are the most vulnerable people to the impacts of climate change right now, the map suddenly looks very, very different again. And just considering who's responsible for the emissions that are causing that right now compared to the size of the countries where we're seeing the most vulnerability, you see America and Europe have gotten very, very small, but you see a lot of vulnerabilities in the likes of Northern and Eastern Africa and in India and in China. So just always considering that when we're talking about who's emitting right now, but also who is responsible for the bulk of emissions that are in our atmosphere from historical kind of pumping of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And then taking it from the global down to the kind of local scale, even in wealthier countries of the global north, who are largely responsible for climate change right now, there are marginalised communities with less power to emit as much greenhouse gases, to defend themselves from climate impacts, to be again in those decision-making spaces and to have their experiences recognised. And this is also true of countries in the global south where we see vast wealth inequality. And so a concept that has come up in kind of global climate justice spaces to talk about this is MAPA, M-A-P-A, which stands for Most Affected People and Areas. And this concept allows us to discuss climate change and climate justice on a local and global level. So acknowledging inequality on a global scale and inequality within countries when discussing the climate crisis, because it's very important to note that inequality within countries, particularly when we're talking about wealth, is growing now at a faster pace than equality between countries. Wealth, again, the key factor. If you have money, if you have disposable income, you're able to better protect yourself, you're able to move out of harm's way in the face of climate change. But also, the wealthier you are, regardless of where you live in the world, the more carbon emissions your lifestyle produces. And so when we talk about kind of groups who climate change unevenly impacts, those MAPA groups can include countries in the global south, poorer people in the global north and south, women and girls, people of color, disabled people, indigenous communities, traveler and Roma communities, LGBTQI+ people, older people, and children and younger people. And specifically our project, I'm going to talk today about women and girls because we do focus quite sharply on gender, but talking about women in all of their diversity as well. And I've tried to pick out some global and local kind of pieces about the impact of climate change on women and girls, with kind of quite a sad fact being that the majority of deaths related to extreme weather events around the world are women. And this is up to 5 times the rate of men. And in the face of climate change, again, when we're talking about that threat multiplier, that exacerbator of existing inequality, women and girls face increased vulnerabilities to all forms of gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence, human trafficking, child marriage, and other forms of violence. It's also a fact that the world's poorest people are disproportionately women, which leaves them with less of a safeguard to recover from loss of resources essential to their livelihoods, such as their home or their land. And climate change, like I said, will exacerbate existing gender inequality. But if we're not paying attention to gender when we're writing our adaptation or mitigation strategies, then we write strategies that don't actually attend properly to the needs of women and girls and can actually make, again, the transition retain gender inequalities or retain sexism. And particularly for women and girls, the culturally gendered work of care and caregiving and as resource collectors, whether that is going to get food directly from the land or going to get food from a shop or a supermarket. It means they experience environmental degradation differently to men and boys. Because care work is key to how women and girls worldwide experience and are impacted by the climate crisis, because caring roles are linked to resource procurement. Basically, we're talking about how you get food, how you use your energy, the transport choices you make, the security choices you make, and climate change and environmental destruction impacts the provision of care because it impacts how you procure or use all of these things. And this essentially genders climate change impacts. Our own project's definition of care work includes both paid and unpaid care work, including care work as paid work in the care sector of the economy, involving things like social care, childcare, and healthcare, including care work which is paid but carried out maybe in less formal settings like the care recipient's home. But we also talk about unpaid care work carried out in families and communities, including care for family members, neighbours, and networks of friends. And just to kind of throw a few examples of kind of the gendered care climate impacts that we might be talking about, because it is quite, for a lot of people, this isn't an area that isn't considered a lot, maybe in typical climate circles. For example, we know that a lot of women champion the use of public transport and active transport, walking and cycling, and they're more likely to use it than men. But also when we talk about trying to make those types of journeys work with caring journeys, and we find that a lot of public transport infrastructure all over the world has been designed with the needs of like the male breadwinner in mind, and there's poor compatibility with caring journeys. Just one example put here is try getting a pram or a wheelchair onto a crowded bus, tram, or train. We're talking about elevators or lifts or escalators being out of order. And we're talking about, at the end of the day, if public transport isn't child friendly to use, then it's immediately more cumbersome for somebody who is caring for children to use. We also talk about implications of energy use in the home related to care work, and this is where our energy use is most immediately billable. So when we see fluctuations in prices of energy, it's poorer households who are hit the hardest, but we also know that women and girls throughout the world are far more vulnerable to energy poverty, the inability to adequately heat or power your home compared to men and boys. Climate change, the kind of more typical example we see impacting crop or food growth, whether this reflects as price increases in supermarkets, where women will feel the cost as the main budgeters of households, or whether you are the person who is literally growing food off of your land and suddenly the growing seasons are completely changed because of climate change caused weather. Women are also more likely to go hungry when food is scarce so that their children can eat. Due to the gender pay and gender pension gap, it's far harder for women to recover property or resources lost due to flooding or storms, which makes caregiving far more difficult, but it also leaves them with less of a base to kind of recover in the aftermath of these events. And things like fetching firewood, fetching water, growing crops are all impacted and made more difficult by the change of climate, such as further to walk or in hotter or more inhospitable conditions. And just to kind of tie back to the missing voices piece of the title of this webinar, at COP29, the UN climate conference, only 8 of the 78 world leaders who participated were women. So you're seeing the climate policies are being written largely by men, and decisions about climate change and how we tackle climate change on a global scale are largely decided by men. And the absence of women in decision making for at all levels, whether it is local or all the way up to the global, results in blind spots in policy making, which can vary from poorly compatible adaptation strategies to outright tragedies in the wake of natural disasters. And we also have to think about socio-cultural ideas about gender when we're thinking about the impacts of climate change. So like, for example, is it appropriate or important for women to learn how to swim in a particular culture? Is it appropriate for them to go to school or work? Are they expected to put everybody's needs before their own? Are they the ones solely in charge of child rearing? Are they allowed to mix in the same spaces as men? Is it seen as proper for them to go into decision making? When there's economic crises, are they the ones who are expected to leave their jobs to look after children? And so on and so forth. And inclusion and consideration of women and girls within climate policies and financing is still very limited. and it doesn't address the full spectrum and impacts of gender inequality, such as unpaid domestic and care work, poor access to healthcare, or gender-based violence. And I just wanted to illustrate here just kind of, again, that intersectional nature of the impacts of climate change, but just some examples from Indigenous communities, for older people, and for Black communities in America. And then there's a piece here again in the upper left corner about the impact of climate disasters on women and children. And again, just thinking about all of these communities and thinking about, like, you know, the kind of aspects of the green transition. Can these people access public transport? Can they purchase an electric vehicle? Are they entirely reliant on things like agriculture to sustain their lifestyle? Do they have disposable income and time to learn about the climate crisis and its impacts? And are they properly represented or considered in climate decision making at all of those levels? So just to always be thinking about that in our practice. And finally, just in our own work, how we always strive to continue using our intersectional climate just community work approach. Try saying that 3 times fast. We use a feminist community work approach in all that we do, which is based on feminist values and on community work and community development values. So that's proper participation, non-tokenistic participation, valuing care, community empowerment, intersectionality, collective action, human rights, social justice and sustainability, and equality in all that we do. And we create accessibility at all our events. We only use accessible venues for in-person events. We use Irish Sign Language or ISL interpretation for online and in-person events. We also try to use our platform and privilege for those who might not always necessarily be able to access climate spaces. We like to, where we can, cover costs of travel and care costs for participants. We do collaborative work for those with limited capacity, like helping people write policy submissions and ensuring that diverse voices are in the climate space. And an important part of our project is building capacity in those communities and with the workers who work within those communities. We create workshops, materials, and webinars that feature diverse voices and experiences, and all of those materials are free to access, and we work directly with communities most impacted where we can. And so that's it from me. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for your contribution. I think what we can remember from your presentation already is this idea that there is the community that we need to think about, who lives within those community, but then within those community itself, there is also an intersect that needs to be taken into account, because when we don't push the lens that far, then we also miss when it comes to the solution that we put on the table. I would like to introduce then our second speaker. The second speaker today is Sumaya Mohammed. She's a passionate young climate justice activist with a proven history of mobilizing and inspiring change. She's a co-founder of the Student Climate Action Network, SCAN. And yes, Sumaya, I'll give you the space to give your presentation.
Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be giving this presentation today, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak again. I guess I'll just give a brief introduction to myself and who I am. Just like Valery said, I am the co-founder of the Students Climate Action Network. Unfortunately, I'm not part of it anymore because I'm not in secondary school, but I was recently elected the Associate General Secretary for Somalis for Sustainability and advisor to the Youth Climate Justice Research Project. And I was a youth delegate to COP27 with SCAN and COP29 with UCC. So I guess I'll just give an introduction of how I got here in the first place and how I really got involved in climate. I mean, I started to get involved in climate when I was 12 years old. So it didn't just begin suddenly. I was already interested in the environment. I liked going outside, I liked swimming and all these type of things. And then one of my teachers said, if anybody's interested in anything to do with the environment, come to this room and we'll have a chat about anything to do with the environment. And I was like, sure, look, why not? Why not go ahead? And at this point, I knew kind of about the climate crisis, but it wasn't like the most important thing in my head. I mean, I was 12 years old, first year in secondary school. I had in my head, I had bigger worries. I was like, am I gonna make friends? What am I gonna do? Am I gonna like my teachers? So I went to that classroom anyways, and then that's where I really started learning about the climate crisis. Like, not in the way that it's just like, oh, something's happening in the distant future and no, I started learning about the climate crisis, intersectionality of the crisis as a whole. And then I felt, coming out of that room, low-key quite overwhelmed. I felt quite overwhelmed. I felt a lot of eco-anxiety. And I think it was something a lot of my friends felt in that room. And then we were like, you know what? We're all feeling this. We're all young people together. Why not do something? Why not actually mobilize and create something to stop feeling so stressed and overwhelmed right now? So as you can see, a lot of people in the front row of this photo, this was the first climate protest organized in Cork. And this was a couple of days ago, 6 years ago, a couple of days ago. So this was on 2019, on March 15th. And this was organized by 12 to 14-year-olds in a classroom every Wednesday at lunchtime, every Wednesday after school, with the help of our volunteer teachers in SCAN. And we were like, okay, maybe if we're lucky, 300 people will come. And then 5,000 people showed up, and we were blown away. I mean, I think only now that I've kind of grown up since, I can really appreciate the dystopian nature of it all. I mean, at the moment, I felt proud of all of our work coming to be, and like it wasn't a flop, I guess. But now, upon reflection, I'm just like, it's not okay for things like this to be happening. It's not okay for so many young people to be leaving their schools, trying to teach their government how to do their job, and trying to tell them that take us seriously because our future and our present is at risk. It was the next protest that was September 19th, I think, and this was the biggest one there. And I'll explain kind of how it kind of died down since, but this was the biggest one. I think up to 7,000 or 9,000 people came, and we were again blown away. I mean, like the amount of community and support you can feel in these type of movements is insane. It's beautiful, but it's also, like I said before, quite dystopian to realize how many young people feel the need to leave their schools. And I guess one thing that you can note as well from our previous speaker about how women and girls are on the front lines of these type of things, look, on the front lines of this, the majority are women and girls. And a lot of the organizations that I'm part of, a lot of them are mobilized by women and girls. And I think I think a lot of organizations have been noting this, especially now that we're looking at everything's being looked at more with the intersectionality lens rather than just looking at it purely through scientific mediums. I think I'll go briefly through this. I mean, I guess this is my own understanding and definition that I would use in my organizations about climate justice, short and sweet, but I know that our speaker beforehand gave a very in-depth definition, but just look at it as a social, ethical, and political approach to climate change. I mean, the climate justice, we have to acknowledge the wealthiest 10% of the world contribute over 50% of global emissions, but low-income communities suffer the most. And I think that climate justice, as opposed to climate action, doesn't just seek to fix the environmentalist kind of lens of the climate crisis, but also seek to address the imbalance by advocating for fair policies and solutions to the climate crisis and seeing how it affects everything. I mean, we can see this. The climate crisis doesn't just, it affects marginalized women and girls more than it would affect the middle class white family, more than it would someone in the global south, and all these type of things. I mean, we can see how nuanced and vast the climate crisis is. And on the next slide, we can see how many people are left out of these climate conversations. Women, 80% of climate refugees are women. Indigenous communities, despite them protecting 80% of global biodiversity, you never see them at these global climate conferences. And if you do see them, it's usually in smaller groups. Fortunately, we're seeing a rise in Indigenous communities attending these type of, like the previous speaker said, like COP, which is a UN climate conference, conferences or climate forums, but it's still simply not enough, especially when they're being on the front lines and protecting our planet. We see that low income and disabled populations are not included in climate conversations, or youth activists in the global south, or youth globally. Marginalized groups contribute the least, like I said previously, to climate change, but they suffer the most. And women in particular, in regards to agriculture, face economic losses whilst Indigenous communities lose land and resources. And I mean, then there's a whole conversation about what happens to Pacific Islands when they go underwater, which is going to be the inevitable truth if the climate crisis isn't solved, despite us having the solutions. It's just with the honestly, the way that policymakers and government officials are not taking this issue seriously as it is, that's going to be the inevitable truth and the inevitable future. We see Black and brown communities and Indigenous peoples and low-income groups and disabled individuals continuously left out of these conversations. But then we see mainstream environmentalism historically being dominated by white middle-class perspectives, with the whole slogan of fight for our future. And I mean, this is true. We are fighting for a future, but we have to acknowledge that people right now all over the world are fighting for their now. Before I attended our COP27 on behalf of SCAN, I watched this one video by Vijay Prashad, and he was speaking at the COP26 People's Plenary. And I think that really changed the game for me, and I would really recommend it to anybody. It's just entitled Vijay Prashad COP26 People's Plenary Speech. And he was saying how the slogan fight for a future is middle class and bourgeoisie, and how it doesn't acknowledge the fact that people in the global south are fighting for their present, they're fighting for their now. And how does a slogan like fight for a future sound to a child who hasn't eaten in days, to a family who hasn't seen rain in months, to farmers whose crops have been completely destroyed by the climate crisis? We have to see our privilege, and we have to understand our privilege, especially here in Ireland, that despite we see some effects of the climate crisis, like let's not get that wrong. I mean, we're still seeing unpredictable weather events. We saw last summer the highest record temperature recorded in Phoenix Park, but we have to acknowledge that it's nowhere near, it's not proportional at all to countries in the global south. And we have to understand, we have to put ourselves into their shoes and see, okay, what can we do here to ensure that frontline communities lead this conversation and recognize how capitalism and colonialism, like how the previous speaker said, how neo-colonialism is at the systemic root of all this injustice, and how environmental degradation coupled with all of those things are so interconnected. We can see that what is activism, why is it important with regards to climate activism? I mean, it holds leaders to account. That's the most important thing. Like I said previously, all these things are so interconnected, and that's why activism in its entirety is so important, regardless if you're a human rights activist. If you're a human rights activist, you're fighting for women's rights, just by proxy. If you're fighting for women's rights, you're fighting for climate justice, because you're seeing how marginalized women are in regards to this whole thing. If you're fighting for climate justice, you're fighting for disability rights, because you're seeing how they're marginalized in these, and so on and so forth. It's a huge domino effect, and that just shows the intersectionality of this whole issue. And I guess just to touch on kind of a brief COP29 reflection, I mean, it's still quite frustrating. Just like previous speaker said, the countries most responsible for the crisis still act like it's a future problem. They act like it's something that they can keep negotiating on over and over again, rather than addressing it head on. And I mean, my whole family is from Somalia, and I think that just highlights the connection I feel towards this crisis. Because when I was at COP27 just 2 years before this, Somalia was facing the worst drought it had faced in over 12 years. And luckily enough, my family back home were not heavily affected by the crisis, but with an economy dependent on agriculture, I mean, you can put two and two together. And I think knowing this, hearing stories from back home, then being at COP27 in Egypt, hearing other people speak saying, oh, Somalia, we have to help them with this drought that they're facing, but then doing absolutely nothing and spending hours and hours discussing tiny little details like an apostrophe, saying party or parties. It's dystopian, it's absurd, and it's not okay. I mean, these COP conferences need reform. And then we see them loaning money, like COP27, the Loss and Damage Finance Facility was established, which is a huge milestone for any of these conferences to actually address the neo-colonialism or the kind of systemic issue of the climate crisis, and how countries in the global south are not equipped with the right resources to actually fight this issue, due to colonialism, due to the extraction of all their resources by countries in the global north. So it was a milestone for the Loss and Damage Finance Facility to be established. But then we see nothing being done. And then we see them saying that they're loaning money, telling them that they're helping them recover maybe from a typhoon that hit, or offer aid to Pakistan due to the floods that occurred. But this isn't aid. I think we need to clarify this. This is not a loan. It's simply returning the money that was stolen from them during the years and years and decades of colonialism. And we see with the phrases, I mean, developed world and developing world. It can't get any clearer how systemic this issue is. But then at COP29, which was great, it actually wasn't great. I'll actually rephrase. The new global climate finance goal was which developed countries committed to mobilizing at least 300 billion annually by 2025. This was completely inadequate, and it's not okay to actually propose this money when research and scientists were saying that the proposed amount that countries in the global south need is up to 5 trillion, and they downscale this drastically to 300 billion. It's not enough to adequately adapt and mitigate to the climate crisis. And I think that's why this whole kind of conference was about no deal is better than a bad deal, and saying that we need to actually stand up and lobby these politicians for actually proposing such an absurd amount of money towards the countries in the global south, because it's simply not enough to actually mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis. How women and girls are at the front lines of the climate impacts, and how female leaders shape global and local environmental policies. They make up 70% of the population living in poverty worldwide. I mean, 80% of people are displaced by climate change, or women and girls, like I mentioned before. We can see that there's so many things that you can do to actually adopt an intersectional approach to climate education, and these slides will be shared soon, so please feel free to read them later on. I mean, I think that intersectional policies help tailor solutions to specific communities that require, but they require significant structural and cultural shifts to be effective. To actually teach with a climate justice approach and lens, rather than just seeing it as a complete scientific issue, you need to make sure that you're becoming aware about the whole nuances to do with the climate crisis. And last, I can see that a lot of the people here who are watching are in some capacities educated, whether you're working with an NGO or with an organization that helps with educating. I mean, educators have the power to inspire change, not just by teaching, but by setting an example. Whether it's working with younger students or older students, I feel like educators empower leaders to learners to appreciate nature and think critically about environmental issues and take meaningful action. I mean, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the educators I had around me in my secondary school, or the fact that I was privileged enough to receive a climate education. And I think that to create a lasting impact, we must not only teach appreciation for nature, but also live it ourselves. And I think I just want to end on how the climate crisis is not a distant threat. I mean, it's happening right now. We see wildfires and floods and heat waves devastate communities internationally. And whilst we may feel insulated in some capacity here in Ireland, it's a privilege that we must recognize. And not everybody has the luxury of waiting. And I think as educators, everybody has a responsibility to empower students, both young and old, but not just with the knowledge, but also with the urgency to act. And true influence comes from action. So if we want students and everybody in our communities to care and take action, we must show them what caring looks like ourselves and lead by example.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sumaya. I think you've made a great point there in terms of like how do we get the missing voices to not be missed anymore. Missing in the action is to come in as a community, and how do we do that? We first have to systemically participate in creating that new system that doesn't put people on the sideline. So it requires work for all of us, but also it requires work from all of us first of all to create that new system. Thank you so much for your contribution. I would like to then introduce our last speaker, Claire Kenny, who is a policy assistant at the Independent Living Movement in Ireland and has been working with ILMI since January 2021. Claire will tell us a little bit about her work, but also about her perspective with this panel. Thank you. Up to you.
Hi, thank you so much, Valerie, for that introduction. Hi, everybody. Thanks to Anya and IDEA for inviting me to participate in this webinar. As was mentioned, my name is Claire Kenny and I'm Policy Assistant with Independent Living Movement Ireland, ILMI. We love our acronyms. In my contribution today, I will first cover a bit about ILMI, explain the historical reasons why disabled people have not participated in climate discussions. I'll give examples of impact that disabled people's lack of involvement has had and how this can be improved. So ILMI is a National Cross Impairment Disabled Persons Organisation, or DPO. Our vision is an Ireland where disabled people have freedom, choice and control over all aspects of their lives and can fully participate in an inclusive society as equals. Our core values, human rights, collective empowerment and social justice, reflect our philosophy of independent living, our ambitions for equality and human rights. they underpin our mission, plans, activities in pursuit of it. Our core values are interlinked and seek to embed and engage these values across all of our functions, priorities, processes, and practices. As the National Disabled Persons Organisation, we are concerned that failure to treat climate change as a global emergency will have even more significant consequences for people who are pushed to the edges of society, and precisely the lives of disabled people nationally and internationally. We recognise and welcome the urgent need to develop measures to reduce our carbon emissions drastically. However, any climate action must not undermine our commitments to include disabled people under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, UNCRPD. We appreciate the development of climate action could be transformative. Investment in sustainable housing, effective and efficient transportation systems are key to moving from environmental disaster to a more sustainable future. However, there is urgent need to engage with disabled persons organisations to ensure that any public investment is fully inclusive and that exchequer funds are designed to meet the needs of everyone. Climate change and environmentalism are as much about social justice as it is about correcting the damage we have done to our planet. However, disabled people are often disregarded in this discourse, and decisions of this environmental social justice. We are frequently seen as an afterthought or an energy burden rather than part of a whole societal transformative effect for our shared future. Having introduced ILMI, I would now like to outline some historical reasons why disabled people haven't been part of climate justice conversations. Until recently, discussions about sustainable development rarely included disabled individuals, despite the fact that many disabled people are everyday environmentalists and passionate about combating the damaging effect on our environment. Inclusion goes beyond physical access. Attitudinal, long-held societal beliefs are significant barriers we face as disabled people. In Irish society, when we, as disabled people, are given a rare platform, we are often asked about our impairments, the limitations they impose, the lack of services, and the obstacles to our participation. Our lives are not solely defined by our impairments. We have complex identities shaped by class, gender, sexual identity, family status, and more. We live full and active lives, yet we are constantly subject to tired tropes, the tragic disabled person or the inspirational hero who overcame their impairment. We are often exploited for charity, but our rightful place as equal members of society who should be consulted on all issues we face is frequently overlooked. The lack of engagement with GPOs about local and national plans to decarbonise Irish society has and will have unintentional impacts on our lives. Nationally and internationally, environmental grassroots organisations have historically been led by non-disabled people who, through a genuine attempt to save the environment, do not take into account those with less resources than themselves. Now that I have explained why we have been excluded from climate justice based on how some people perceive disability, I will provide you with some examples of this. ILMI recognise the need to reduce our carbon footprint by trying to reduce our reliance on cars in towns and cities. However, due to the lack of engagement with disabled persons organisations, as per state commitments under the UNCRPD, some measures are having unintended negative consequences on the lives of disabled people. The deposit return scheme was brought in without meaningful engagement with disabled people. As a result, they are inaccessible to many disabled people due to many factors such as the height of the bins. The fact you have to return to the shop might be impossible for some disabled people, but there is no alternative method provided for returning your plastic bottles. Yet all disabled people are being charged the deposit fee, which adds to the cost of disability, which according to the Indicon report published in 2021, the cost can be between 9,000 and 12,000. Looking at measures taken during COVID-19 pandemic, hard-fought gains by disabled people over decades in terms of the safety of pedestrian areas and parking spaces were steadily eroded over that period, where temporary changes in public spaces in some cases have now become into sometimes unwelcome permanency. Disabled people are being denied access to our towns and cities by pavements restricted to our ease of movement due to new allowances permitted for unregulated external dining. Our disabled parking spaces were removed to locations without reference to where and why the original location was a place of most access to facilitate disabled people accessing the towns and city centres. The promotion of floating bus stops, which impede disabled people and people with limited mobility in safely accessing public transport systems, and the promotion of dangerous shared spaces are directly impacting our ability as disabled people to participate with accompanied ease of freedom in society. These examples highlight the significant issues of restricting the mobility of tens of thousands of disabled and older individuals. Such decisions made with good intentions to promote sustainability, yet devoid of our input, have a profoundly negative impact on the lives of disabled people. They also illustrate the complete absence of constructive processes involving disabled individuals and DPOs in Ireland. Furthermore, without mechanisms to engage authentically with genuine DPOs, there is tangible concern that climate change policies will undermine the inclusion of disabled people in society. So, what are examples of good practice models? Disabled people are only now beginning to be invited actively involved in policy decision-making spaces, including climate implementation of sustainable development goals and active travel. This is progressive and a massive step forward to achieving a more equal and just society. Practices that could be implemented to ensure climate policy and a just transition is achievable. Consult with disabled persons organisations as they have the knowledge and expertise to ensure that your programme is inclusive. There are nuances to impairment that non-disabled people will not understand, as this is not their lived experience. We need to move from consultation to co-creation, from passively being asked to participate in consultations where policy has already been decided, towards resourcing disabled people to work together to drive and development of policies, practices and systems. We must move from engaging with disabled people individually to structured engagement with us collectively through our DPOs. Disabled service providers cannot speak on our behalves. Benefits of including different perspectives. By including marginalised groups, you are bringing different perspectives, expertise and experience to the forefront, thus eliminating inadvertent exclusion and ensuring that climate policy does not negatively affect a proportion of society. A bigger pool of expertise. For example, disabled people are natural problem solvers, as we have to live in a sometimes inaccessible world. Thankfully, with more engagement with disabled people and disabled persons organisations, this is changing for the better. Climate policy and initiatives will benefit everyone. For example, the curb effect is good for disabled people, but it's also good for parents with buggies and temporarily disabled people. In conclusion, I wanted to introduce ILMI briefly and share some reasons why disabled individuals have been overlooked in decisions regarding climate justice. I have provided examples of how this exclusion manifests and leads to further marginalisation of disabled people and practices that could be implemented to ensure climate policy and a just transition are achievable. The benefits of a just transition are attainable if we collaborate to create more equitable, sustainable and inclusive society. Thanks for listening.